Welcome, everyone. I was really deeply moved by yesterday morning's land acknowledgement coming from Carla. It was really quite something to hear about the words like Taikaranto and the language it comes from, the peoples, and learning more about the land that we're in, and the importance of recognizing those who have been here from time immemorial and the way they have taken care of the land and encourage us to do the same. So here we are, Taikaranto, in the midst of Turtle Island. Most of us as settlers, one way or another, some of us as the original inhabitants of this land. And it's important to recognize that. I know when we do land acknowledgements now with Sapamo, we don't just talk about that we're in Taikaranto, and this is the dish with one spoon, which is a wampum or a treaty agreement between the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee, which is important. But we also ask people, and those who are in the, on Zoom, if you can write in the chat room, the peoples in the areas you live in. It's important for us to become familiar with the specific nations, the specific languages, the specific cultures, not just the homogenized indigenous peoples or Aboriginal peoples, or whatever term we were using, to be able to say Mohawk, to be able to say Cree, to be able to say Anishinaabe, to be able to say the Haudenosaunee, to be able to say the Mississauga of the Credit. We are on Treaty 13, a claim of the credit of the Mississauga of the Credit on this territory that we are on. And there are many other claims across the country as well. So I wanted to start with that, and I do encourage those who are online, if you want to put something in the chat room about where you're at across this wonderful land that we are on, whether you might be in the East Coast and so might want to put in the Wollastock, you might be in the West Coast and might want to write in the Coast Salish. You might be in the middle and want to write into Blackfoot if you're in Alberta, and that kind of thing. How do we become more and more familiar with the peoples who are on this land before we arrive, just taking care of it? And I just want to remind from Carla's comment yesterday, when she talked about the seventh generation, I love the quote that she put up, is that we don't inherit the land from the ancestors, we take care of it for the children coming after. If we keep that in mind, we might be able to save the earth, which is in peril, but we do need to honor that and as we go forward today. So I wanted to start with that as a way of waking us up this morning. It's a rainy day in Toronto, very rainy for early December. We have an interesting panel today. We have interesting panels all the time, but this one, I'd like to say, this one is actually about something that I think is rather hot right now in the performing arts community. How do producers, presenters, and artists work together? What are success stories? What are the things, and I don't mean success stories about here's the great example of how you should do it, but here's what we learn through experience. Right? We sometimes need to count the areas in which, oh well, didn't do that as well as one might have thought. However, what did we learn out of it and how do we improve? So a while ago, CanStage and Luminato together approached Sapamo and asked us if we would look at what are some good practices in onboarding artists to work within the producing companies. And it's not just Luminato and CanStage, this is about the sector, because we're hearing this from other organizations as well. So we invited Anita La Selva, a well-known theater artist, dramaturge, practitioner, etc., to come in and work with us on that. And what we're doing today is presenting that report. We would hope the report is really a springboard for further conversations. I highly doubt it's the end product, because there's just too many artists and too many producers around who are going to approach it probably in different ways. But we wanted to talk about some of the key issues that we saw in terms of what can make the relationship between artists and producers, presenters, better. And to us, it's a conversation. To us, it's about relationship building. So what we're going to do is I'm giving a bit of the overview, as I just did. Anita's going to talk about some of the research, the methodology we use, who we
for 2 nights. If I lived in Montreal, I would jump on
how that fits into this thing.
that.
I'll wrap it up the first in the report on here are some of the steps that we think are important for presenters and artists. It's a two-way, this is a dialogue to work together And then we're going to open the floor to a conversation. We have S.A. Mensa, who's online. She's out in Vancouver, I believe, or BC somewhere. And she's going to be joining us as one of the panelists. We have Brendan Healy, the Artistic Director of Can Stage. We have Naomi Campbell, the Artistic Director of Luminato. We have Ryan Cunningham, the artist at large. Doing a lot of great work. And those who know S.A., dancer and choreographer and very engaged in promoting these kinds of ideas. So I'm going to turn it over to Anita to start us off, and then I'll do some of the concluding parts, and then we'll open the floor for conversation.
I don't think, oh, here, now it's working, great. Good morning, hi. So I'd like to start this by giving an overview of how we went about this research after Canadian Stage and Luminato approached us. So a lot of our research involved reaching out to different companies in Canada, in the US, in the UK, as well as conducting focus groups within Canadian Stage and Luminato right here in town. So what we wanted to do is focus on best practices and the positive. So I'm always a philosopher of like, why focus on the negative when we can look at the positive? So I reached out to several companies and we gathered information related to a presenter's process. We looked at practices for selection of artists, onboarding artists and arts groups, as well as the daily interfacing practices that the core members of each organization had with the different artists and artist groups that came through. The focus was on the interactions with BIPOC artists, culturally specific sectors, disability, and other marginalized groups, so that we could find ways in which we could welcome artists from right across the spectrum and make every artist group feel like they belong and that they have a place in the organization, as well as figuring out how the organization can share their philosophy, methodology, ecology, and core values with every artist that comes through their doors, so that we can mitigate any kind of conflict or misunderstandings due to lack of expectations. So I reached out to the companies I reached out to were, besides Canadian Stage and Luminato, were the Battersea Arts Centre in the UK, the Walker Arts Centre in Minneapolis, Steppenwolf in Chicago, the Royal Court in the UK, Tangled Arts Toronto, the Broad Stage in Santa Monica, Why Not Theatre Toronto, the Images Festival in Toronto, Inc. Arts UK, Peggy Baker Dance Projects, which Sapamo has done extensive work with over the past few years, and the Globe Theatre in Regina. And so the research focused on 6 categories. So first of all, we looked at onboarding. So the initial meetings with artists and companies. How does that happen? Then we looked at daily interfacing. So what is the communication and the daily interface that the core members of the organization, as well as contract members of the organization, have with the various artists and artist groups. We also examined the policies, procedures, codes of conduct that each company has and how they're shared with each artist and artist group. Then we looked at how to deal with conflict, and I'm going through this quite quickly because it's in the report, so I just wanted to give everyone an overview, okay? So you can find everything in great detail in the report. Then we looked at how to deal with conflict, challenging issues, how to monitor and reporting on things, and then education and training. So I interviewed a number of different members of these companies. So for example, one company I might have interviewed an artistic director or the artistic team. Another company I would interview a producer. Then I would interview an HR person or someone. So I wanted to get a real cross section of perspective of different companies and what the different players in each company, what their perspective was on these aspects. And so then what we did was, Charles and I, we collected some of these best practices in terms of what was really working for these companies, what were some of the what were the overlaps, what were the commonalities that everyone was stressing was really important, and what the discoveries that they've been making over the past few years in terms of dealing with onboarding artists and how to sort of induct them into the methodology and the ecology of the company. I want to just go through a few highlights. So just before I do that, with Canadian Stage and Luminato, we conducted focus groups with. We spoke with the artistic directors, the CEOs, artistic producers, a lot of the individual producers who work with companies, some of the production managers who manage the stage manager, and who manage the contract staff. We also spoke with the publicity and marketing people, which Charles and I found was a really important category that oftentimes is overlooked when it comes to interfacing with artists, because oftentimes the communications and the publicity team is a first line of contact with the artist. So having them have a good understanding of the artist's needs, where the artists are coming from, was really significant. So that's sort of a big picture of how we went about this. What I want to do now is just want to go through and give you the highlights of what we found. I'm just going to summarize the highlights of the best practices that we found in each category quickly, and then Charles will talk about some recommendations. So in terms of onboarding, the one commonality that all these companies had in terms of best practices were the one-to-one face-to-face meetings with artists or artist groups. So as opposed to in the onboarding process, just limiting it to emails or dealings with agents, that there was so much more success and camaraderie established when producers or artistic directors were able to meet. And even if they weren't able to meet in person, face-to-face, Zoom was just as well. But all the companies said that stressed the importance of meeting with the artists in advance, sharing their perspectives on terms of what their expectations were with the artists, and what sort of the ecology of the company was, as well as asking the artist, what do you need? So it was a real give and take. The biggest successes that we tracked where when the company was able to really center the artist and ask what the artist needed, and also really be clear with their expectations of the artist and what the artist was bringing to the company. So then that would mitigate conflict later down in terms of dates, timelines, things like that. And inducting the artist into the core values of the organization. And this takes me into the best practices for the daily interfacing with artists and communication. Again, right across the board, we found that when there was a specific producer or curator assigned to each artist group or artist company, then we had the most success because they always had someone to answer to. Obviously, artistic directors, CEOs are very busy people, and they often don't have time to drop in every day onto a rehearsal, but to have a core member who is assigned to these groups to be able to be a direct liaison proved to be very successful in terms of creating those open lines of communication. Having additional support for marginalized, racialized artists. This was a big one that came up many times, and that is that when organizations are dealing with artist groups who are from marginalized sectors, to have a representative that is from the same lived experience as the artist group is. That came up as very important repeatedly, just because sometimes artists are dealing with difficult material, and there's a greater level of comfort when they can speak to someone who has a similar lived experience to them, and hence then the artistic process becomes smoother, becomes easier, becomes more supported. So that was some of the places. I mean, we're also getting into finances here, but some of the places who had inclusive practice managers found that these were very successful, to have practice managers who would liaise with different artists. One of the companies, Globe Theatre, has actually hired an Indigenous artist to spend the entire season with them, sharing practices with folks. So different companies have done different things. Also, the other big thing with daily interfacing was contract staff. Contract staff oftentimes is not aware of the artist needs or where the artist companies are coming from. So how can the organization offer contract staff training or information about the different companies that are coming in and what the specific needs are from each company or each artist, particularly if they're from a specific sector. Open door policy is a big one for everybody. Sustainability, not burning staff out and having them work on too many things at once, spreading staff too thin. That was another one. In terms of policies, procedures, codes of conduct, yeah, this was another one that came up repeatedly. The most successful companies would share them in person versus send them by email. As we know, oftentimes we get so many emails per day, we often don't read them or don't go through them, or oftentimes if an agent gets the codes of conduct, they'll send them to the artist, and the artist won't read them. So what are ways in which companies can share these policies in person, either on the first day of rehearsal or in a meeting or via a Zoom meeting or something? So just really looking at having each artist company read these policies and sign off on them was another commonality that came up. In terms of dealing with conflict, challenging issues, obviously, you know, big successes came when there were facilitators, HR teams happening, but that's not necessarily mandatory. Having a really strong code of behavior that people can follow and an escalation process so that the lines, that's something that's very clearly defined, and having someone who can liaise with that, someone who's there able to liaise with the company and with the organization heads to be able to facilitate dealing with this conflict. Similarly, with the monitoring reporting, having a direct line of communication, something very clear so that artists and core staff are very clear on if there's something that needs to be reported. Again, it is about setting expectations. I mean, I think what I'm saying is overall is the best practices are setting the expectations and setting people up for success so that there's a process and a step-by-step way of dealing with things throughout the entire process. You'll see in the document that the Royal Court in the UK has created a document that they've shared with the international theatre community, and they have a very, very well outlined reporting policy and how it happens and step-by-step and who you go to, and they have actually offered that up to the theatre community in general, right across the globe. So any company can use that. Any company can feel free to use that series of 6 steps that they've created. And then the last thing is the education and training, something that came up as very important. Anti-racism training for all core staff. Also training for contract workers. Again, if they're working with specific groups that are coming in. And it could be a training module. It doesn't have to be an in-person. I know everybody's busy and time is money. It could be a training module that they watch, they observe, and they sign off on. If there are specific shows that are very sensitive in terms of culture, then to have an expert there, to have someone who is there to facilitate that process. So yeah, I think overall what we found was the more you can set yourself up as an organization to have your core values solid and being able to share them and share what the expectations are, as well as discovering and finding out with those questions what the artist needs, then the greater chances that you'll have of a smoother relationship throughout this entire relationship of engagement. So that's the overview of the research. I'm going to pass it back to Charles. Thank you.
Thanks, Anita. And as you can imagine, sitting back, I was looking at the report again last night to prepare for today, and it struck me about, wow, what a radical change this would be. And I want to begin that way because it suggests we need to take time, particularly in the arts ecology that we're in, where we are giving agency or giving support to artists from indigenous, racialized, queer communities, deaf and disabled, et cetera, folks who have not been in the systems for quite some time, and folks who may have practices that are not understood within the systems as well as they might be. So time becomes the enemy. I'm reminded of Allen Ginsberg's poem Howl, where he talks about, you know, the beats of the 50s who got jobs, and his line is, and clocks fell on their heads for the next decade. And sometimes we're racing against time. You know, we've got a production that has to go on this day, we've already advertised. Meanwhile, the artists are supposed to get up and do certain things, perform and so on and so forth, but there's a whole background that Anita has touched on. So in the report is available online right now in the chat room, so you can easily download it and look at it yourself. I'm looking at the last number of pages, which really talk about the roles and responsibilities not just of the producers, presenters, but also of the artists. It has to be a two-way street. Artists need to assume the agency to say, I need this to make this work. However, on both sides, it's going to require significant planning. Right? That time to say it's not just sign a contract, it is let's talk about when will you be in the space? How are you preparing for the space, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How do you have the conversation inside the organization? Communication that's internal as well as external. So everyone's pretty clear about where they're going, what's going on, how they can have input into decisions that are being made about engaging with artists and engaging with communities. Being clear about roles and responsibilities. So if there is a producer, for example, who is assigned to the artist, then who is that producer responsible to in the event something is beyond the producer's capacity to actually deal with? And if the producers seem to be the difficulty, then whom can the artist go to make sure that he, she, they can have some resolution around the issues? So there's a whole series of roles and responsibilities that are not just for the presenting bodies, the producers, but also for the artists. In terms of the producers and the presenters, it's obviously getting more and more of an understanding of what does it mean to work with diverse arts practices. Practices that are perhaps collaborative in their creative process. As Anita talked about, subject matter that may be very sensitive and that might trigger people. And so on. So how can care be given to those kinds of things? And also the subject matter that may come out of the person's performance. I remember in this room seeing Cliff Cardinal's work, and wow, you can say, woof, a lot of tough stuff goes into Cliff's work if you're familiar with it. So what's the process on him taking care of himself, the audience getting familiar with it, the producers getting familiar with it, et cetera, et cetera. And then that internal support that Anita did speak about. We broke it out in a number of ways to kind of say, okay, what should the producers be doing? What is their particular role and responsibility? How do they set up their first meeting? How do staff share with each other around what's happening so that there is an ongoing communication? Hey, I noticed this today, or okay, we seem to be doing rather good over there, but what about this kind of thing? So that the staff come at it as a team and not just as, well, I'm the person you're supposed to connect with and that kind of stuff. How to encourage the artists and enable the artists to give feedback. Okay, this really worked well for us. However, when you set the microphones up this time, it didn't work as well as whatever that might be, right? So that, again, the artists understand they have the agency. They already have the agency. It's the presenters and the producers saying, we really need to hear from you. We really need to hear from you. And then bringing issues forward if it needs to be done jointly as artists and as producers or presenters to say, okay, we really need to have a roundtable conversation, and who should be in that roundtable conversation? The same when we talk about the production of the tech staff, similar format, first meeting, staff sharings, artist feedback, bringing issues forward. Same with the contractors, except we add with the contractors because they would come from outside the organization, providing education and training, which Anita has already talked about, because we don't know whether or not they have anti-racism training, whether or not they are familiar with non-harassment, non-discrimination, workplace violence, policies, procedures, and protocols, and so on and so forth. So you have to make sure that they understand that before they actually engage in the organization. And again, they get involved with sharing with staff in the same way because they're brought in for the organization to work for the organization, so they should be part of the organization's team for the time they're there. Sort of the last page, we talk about implementing the change. And it goes through in specifics. So for example, the artistic director confirming the presenter's interest or the producer's interest in supporting the artist's work for a performance. You get a call, hey, I want to. Then how does that cascade into the conversations with the CEO, general manager, the artistic director, et cetera? How do the documents, whether it's a welcoming document or a sharing of policies and procedures, get to be clearly understood by all sides? I'll give you a little story. A little while ago, I went to see a wonderful jazz performance by great artist Khalil al-Jabbar. It was the day after Pharaoh Sanders had died. And Khalil had a relationship with Pharaoh. He decided to tell a funny story about that relationship, where one time he was at a venue, and the contract was offered to him. One of the clauses in the contract was that Pharaoh would have to do a keynote at a university. you know, Khalil just signed the contract. Never talked to Pharaoh about it. And then, of course, the producer comes up and says, okay, Pharaoh, we've got you set up for this keynote next week. And what keynote? What keynote, right? I mean, it happened, but it was a surprise. And so the sense is to make sure that the artist, the artistic director of any company is coming in that he, her, their, etc., his company knows what the expectations are. It's not you tell the artistic director, and that's all good. The artistic director should be communicating that to all of the artists that he, she, they are involved in the program. Right? And so that becomes a line of communication when I talk about artists and presenters, producers taking responsibility. The agreement at the end of the day, you know, if the artist wants to suggest some things that are essential to their work, then that should be in the contract. And it should be a negotiation, a relationship building. If you have brought us in to do this work, and if you want it to look good, here's what we need from you, that should be in the contract. So we're all agreed at the end of the day as to what we're setting out to do. With even nuances to say, hey, if something comes up, can we have a conversation? As opposed to unilaterally, no, you can't do that, that kind of stuff. I'm gonna leave it at that, because there are 12 things that we do point out in terms of steps. But I do want to iron out that, or end with, it is a relationship where agency is on both sides. And in my view, the presenter, producer has to be open to saying, yes, we are inviting you in, but let's talk about what that means so that we're clear on our side about what you want, need to make this work. And the artist saying, thank you, happy to do work with you, happy to be on your stage. Let's talk about what that means in terms of the day-to-day engagement that we will have with you so that we're all good at the end of it all and that audiences appreciate the work. So saying that, I'm going to open it up to some of our panelists. And I want to point out that while Brendan and Naomi currently work in CanStage and Luminato, they're not necessarily here to speak about CanStage and Luminato, although they're certainly welcome to. But about the ecology, because the idea with this report is that, yes, it'll be good for those two organizations. They've commissioned the work, we've delivered it to them. They've had a chance to review and give feedback on it. That's the way we work in relationship. No point making a crazy idea that they say, whoa, 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 we don't have $10 million and that kind of stuff. But again, speaking to the importance in the producing and presenting community as to why this works. And we also have two artists, Ryan Cunningham and S.A. Mensa. S.A. is online, so she'll appear at some point. She's getting herself settled in a rehearsal out in BC, as I said earlier. So I'm going to hand it on to whoever wishes to speak. You've got microphones there. Away you go.
Check. Hello. Tansei, hello. Thank you very much, Charles. Anita, thank you. And Brendan, nice to see you. As always, it's reaffirming to hear the findings of this report, to hear the analogy to treaty, because I think that's why I wore this hat today. It's Section 35, referring to Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution Act. Reaffirming our obligations and the negotiations within the treaties with Indigenous communities in this country. And I believe it's so much of what we're talking about, a building of relationship, establishing protocols, establishing the needs, wants, and desires, and most importantly, to check in regularly, because just like I believe we're talking about here, they're living documents, meaning they evolve, they grow, they change, and they have to, because so does the world, and so do we, and our needs and stuff. And I think it's just so important to remember that this is also not something that is foreign to us. For thousands of years, Indigenous people and other groups around the world have negotiated their space in the world with each other. Our Indigenous nations had very specific ways of doing this, which was shared with European settlers, and those became the treaties. An interesting thing about the treaties, I remember hearing an elder, Narcissus Blood, from the Blood Reserve in Calgary's involved in making Treaty 7 project, And he said if they could have taken the land, they just would have. I was thinking about this a lot in last night, this morning. They would have, by force, if they could. They did everywhere else in the world that they could, and they would have, so they couldn't. So they had to have treaties. And then, of course, and just like around Niagara, they'd meet every year up until War of 1812. Then after that, done. No longer had to check in about treaties because they no longer needed the help, needed against the U.S. invasion. And I find us in a really interesting position in the arts world where it feels like the major organizations and gatekeepers now need us, and they're coming to the table to discuss and figure out how to work together. And I think this is an exciting time. I say that as well to remind people that this is very new to us as artists as well. We've never had access. We've never had invitations to these buildings and organizations, and now we do. And so it is a change for us as well. It's something we're learning again. We're learning our agency. We're learning our value. We're learning how to vocalize our value, and it's still very fresh and new for us. And so we just wanted to say that because I believe it's fresh and new for everyone on either sides. And it's really important for us to remind each other that we are figuring this out together, and we want this to be as good as it can be for everyone involved, and to just come to the table with that joy and the gentleness. Yeah, I guess I just wanted to start off with that. It's something I've been thinking about a lot over the last 24 hours in sort of the historical and artistic sort of analogy there. And yeah, just want to get that off my chest.
Brendan or Naomi, Essay is still in travel, so she'll be with us soon.
Hello. Hi. There's so many things I've thought about this for a long time as we've been working through this process, and obviously for years in the making of work. What always strikes me in these conversations is that so much of it is really obvious. Like it's like, duh, like to be really sophisticated. When we make new work with a group of artists as for itself, I don't mean like for an organization, I mean when you come together in order to make some kind of project. This is me speaking as somebody who comes out of independent theater, even though I've been working at Luminato now for 12 years. But the basis of the work that I've done was always in small groups, in smaller organizations, where the whole point was to just try and make work in the way that made the most sense for the project at the time, and to be really specific about what the needs are, and if the need is time, or if the need is space, or if the need is 37 people, like to try and create the conditions for the work to be created. And I think as you know, I moved into an institution that has more structure, I suppose, and certain expectations from the public about what we're going to do when, at what time of year, for how many people. Then it is easy to defer to the kind of those deadlines, to defer to the demands of the structure. And I think so this is a moment of bringing those two kinds of practices together, because there's expectations on the parts of artists on how they want to work, but there's also expectations on the part of our audiences about what they are going to get to participate in, engage with, see. And so how do we both make the work in the way that makes the most sense for any given project, and also deliver it, for lack of a better term, in the right time. So I think all of that comes down to the very earliest conversations, of course, that we have when we begin a project, and what people's needs are, what their timelines are, not to assume that something can happen in 6 months, maybe it's 18 months, maybe it's 24. One of the things that was interesting, I think, about the pandemic, for those of us who were able to support artists through that time, was that actually projects there wasn't new projects that came up necessarily, but just that the projects that people were working on got to be worked on in more depth, and they got to go back and do another layer of work on something, and that was obviously is very beneficial, and something that we haven't always thought we can afford. I think expectations I keep coming back to that word. That was the one I'd written down before you even said it, Charles, today, because it's expectations on the part of the organizations and on the part of the artists and the audiences about what we are able to do in the best way possible. Maybe in this moment when people are shifting back and into the, going out again, and yet there's also skepticism about it in some cases. And I've been to shows that are full, and I've been to shows that aren't. And maybe that means we do less better, and we do less, but we do it deeper, and we do it, we work on things for longer. The problem, of course, with that is there are so many people with great projects who want to do work, and how do we determine that? Like that becomes the hardest question, I think. There was something else I was going to say, just about contracts, I guess, treaties, documents, that the fluidity of them is really important, that the ability to change them is really important. Obviously, there are, we write these things down so that we can go back to them and say, this is what we decided, and we understood, but that's useless if you don't talk about it. As you said, I mean, I think the question about expectations that you bring up, the agent is a really tricky thing, and I don't feel that so much working on larger theater or visual art projects, that sort of dance projects, where I feel like eventually I do get access to the artist and I can have those conversations. But we're also a music presenter, and I would love nothing better than the musicians who come from other parts of the country, other parts of the world to perform at the festival could take a day and do a workshop, meet with their, the folks in the community who are interested in the same kind of work. But sometimes you never get to meet beforehand, you never get to meet musicians, because there are so many levels of gatekeeper, especially when we're talking about more famous artists with more, there's more money at stake. But wouldn't it be nice to be able to have that conversation with them earlier? And that's a whole other level of education, I suppose, in terms of our artists' relationships with agents, which are there for a good reason, but also sometimes that becomes a place of misunderstanding. And how do we broach that, I guess? I can stop
there. Is this on? Yeah. I mean, there's so much to say. I mean, first of all, big thank you, Anita and Charles, for this report. I think it's a really, really important document. There's so much in it to unpack. Expectations, clarifying expectations is one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is getting beyond assumptions, and that as we're working with different kinds of artists who have different practices, who come from different perspectives, like, we cannot assume anything, and we need to create processes or opportunities for communication so that we can get beyond assumptions. And there's a lot, I think, in this document that is really around just get over your assumptions. The second thing that I'm thinking a lot about is like the weird job that is an artistic director in that. Often, like, we're actually kind of like social architects. Like, what we're doing is we're sort of bringing people together, and then kind of like, okay, go do your thing. And I think traditionally was kind of like, okay, here's the rehearsal hall. Someone's leading this. Good luck, and I hope it goes well. And that has to change. The demand of social architecture is where you're brokering relationships, you're creating new connections, you're the conduit for different practices, and in a way the job has to be really different than just like getting an interesting mix and say good luck. There's a lot. What isn't so explicit in this document, but is all in the document, is like just the various relationships of power that exist. In an organization that's hierarchical, then in a creative process, which is often hierarchical, and then in an industry that is extremely hierarchical and like even what you were saying, Naomi, about working with musicians, often I'm like chasing after an artist and they have their agent has all the power, and we have very little, like we're just like please come to Toronto, or please work with me, please, whatever you need, I'll give it to you. And then there's other situations where artists are coming to us with that same feeling. So it's like a very that is a big aspect of everything inside this document. Another thought. They're just like chaotic thoughts. I apologize. Like another thought is I feel like so much of the work that I'm engaged with right now is sort of looking at systems and trying to determine what is this piece, what piece of this system can I actually influence, and really like trying to be rigorous in defining what that is, so that my intention can have impact, as opposed to putting my intention into things where actually I can't have impact. And that's I find that to be a very complex kind of cognitive process, and is often trial and error that we kind of learn. Oh, no, I don't have impact there. Oh, that's actually somewhere I could have actually made a difference and I didn't. I think that the question too is like why? Why look at onboarding and I sit with that question a lot. I mean, I think ultimately what I want to see is like loving, supportive, rigorous, challenging creative spaces for people to thrive, and that's ultimately I think what the goal is for me. And so onboarding is it's like where you start is everything to kind of create that, and it's so it is but yet it isn't, and yet like when you carry all the assumptions that one carries, you have to go to the root to undo those assumptions, and you have to spend time in like working with the soil to kind of really understand what it is that you need to kind of put together as a mix for a thing to thrive. So that's a huge takeaway from just this whole document. So those are some chaotic thoughts.
Thanks, Brendan. A couple of things that I've heard, and Issei is now here, so I'm going to ask her to join in a second as she gets herself settled. But this focus on expectations, what is the expectation of the artist? What is the expectation of the producer-presenter? And how can they be clear with each other? I really love this sense of the clarity around it. We just added in the chat room a document that Kevin did for us almost some time ago called Tilling the Field, Unearthing Collaborative Practices in the Arts, because we are dealing with issues of power. We really are, Presenters, producers make an offer that has some cash at the end of it to artists who tend to want that cash, right? And don't have as much cash as the presenter or producer would have. So power is right there. And then how to negotiate across that so it's clear that there are equity issues at play here. There are equity issues at play. And if it's an indigenous artist, an artist of color, they get manifold, depending upon who they are and how they fit into it. Before we get to essay, I just want to also look at that comment on social architecture. That is a really important one that producers, presenters have. How do they influence public attitudes with the work that they present? Right? In a day in which we are living in, which we're seeing, as Ryan talked about earlier, the increasing number of indigenous artists, artists of color, who are also getting more comfortable with their sense of agency and purpose, right? What are we constructing in society? What are we constructing? Are we constructing better understanding of their artistic practices and the stories that come with them and the methods that go into their work? Or are we staying with the status quo? Well, that's what the audience wants to see, and we're just going to go with that. Another assumption. Another assumption. He says here, right there. So we'll go to her.
Charles, just to say it's actually pronounced AC. It's all good. It's all good. I get it all the time. I had to join from my phone because the Wi-Fi at the studio isn't actually as great as I had hoped it to be, but welcome everybody. I'm coming to you from Kelowna, Okanagan area in BC. I'm working with Ballet BC right now. And so I appreciate your patience with me as I got picked up and the dancers are getting ready for class right now before we start working, setting our work on the company here. To speak a bit, I've been able to listen in and out, but I've been able to hear, and I appreciate the document that was brought together, the research that was brought together. One of my big things with this particular subject is, well, a few thoughts. There's what I have found in doing equity work with a number of different groups, and just obviously being an artist as well. Through the changes, there's practice and then there's theory. Working with organizations like SAPAMA, which is amazing, it gets people to understand the theory of what's happening. And then to me, sometimes there's a disconnect between what is said in a document and how you actually treat me as a human in practice. And that to me is the issue that I'm finding with a lot of organizations, is that they've done the work, you've excavated, you've assessed, you've done all of the necessary things to understand the issues that are actually formed in your organization. But then there's the theory. How does this actually work in a practical sense? How does this actually work in a person-to-person relationship? And how do we build this dynamic, and how do we both understand each other to be able to know how to move forward? Because your document might say something else to how I actually need to have this relationship with you. So I think a lot of it is an understanding on a human level on who we are as people. And this goes for both artist and presenter, you know, when onboarding and knowing that there's going to be somebody there, like that's extra work for people that work in these organizations that are already spent, to be honest. It's like everybody's already at their wits end. Everybody's already tethering a very small line to be able to continue to create art. And so to ask for more, obviously it comes at a cost. So how can we really develop more interpersonal relationships between artist and producer that is understood on both sides, that we really can understand and feel each other, and that we can have a level of honesty. Another layer to that is, as you onboard different artists have different ways of working. And not everybody even understands the value of being able to share your own voice. As I'm working with the ballet company right now, I'm asking these artists questions, and many of them are silent because they're not used to being spoken to. And so, and that's just in this setting. Obviously, within the commercial dance, that's a whole other setting in terms of people actually asking and inquiring, how do you feel? Well, I'm not used to being asked that question. I've actually never been asked that question in terms of how I feel. So I can't even connect how the information of what you're asking me to create or what you're asking me to embody is problematic, because that's a regular thing. And so there's multiple cultures that are being tested right now, that I think it's really necessary to understand the nuances. And, you know, in many ways it's harsh to say, but change usually comes through bloodshed. So how is the bloodshed that happened within the community an opportunity for us to realize, well, maybe we should have looked at things differently. Maybe we should have assessed. Maybe we actually should have brought people on sooner.
She's back.
I am so sorry. I'm here. I'm so sorry. I got a call and I pressed the wrong button. My apologies. Hold on, let me make sure. There we go. Yeah, technology at its finest. My apologies. But yeah, so how do we minimize the amount of bloodshed that has to happen in order to change? Um, Sometimes things start as an idea, which is amazing, and having ambitious ideas is what our community needs, especially within the dance world. I work a lot in theater, and the thought of having a set in dance is ambitious. The thought of having more than 3 shows is ambitious, and theater is the norm. So I think that there's fundamental things that we are used to working at a scarcity. We are used to working with leftovers as artists, and I think that it's necessary as artists, as presenters, that we understand, like, if we're taking bigger chances with our stories, and really understanding holistically who we are as artists, as racialized majority folks. What does that mean, and what do I need in the space? Similar to what Ryan had said earlier, there's ancestral knowledge, there's things that we are moving forward with, and so how do those things also make space in the room, and how do we actually push some of the artists that are really trying to move forward, or how do we inspire artists to take bigger chances? And maybe that means curating differently, or maybe that means being with an artist every step of the way in order for them to be able to achieve. You know, it's tricky to say, and I say this with all of the love. Financially, the money that gets invested into certain people, and we don't get a chance to really see the product equal out to the investment. So it's necessary for artists to feel like, oh, I can feel supported in that same way, and I can create something beyond everybody's dreams, because they understand who I am as an artist. And that, to me, is the thing that is really valuable. So it's great to see artists and presenters really thinking larger. But please don't forget about the folks within the Canadian landscape as we continue to dream big, to make sure that we're not leaving anybody behind. I think that, to me, is a big issue. And so within this dynamic and relationship, it's really just everything comes down to communication, and how that communication can really give us a chance to know and learn and grow, and recognize that we're humans, and recognize we're going to make mistakes. We're going to step on each other's toe. We might even cut a limb off, you know? But we have to recognize the love and the need of us wanting to grow as a community. And that's the thing that we're wanting to be able to expand.
Thank you, thank you. I do want to open the floor to those who are either here or online. If you have any questions or comments, feel free, please, to do that. I think what you're hearing from all sides here is the sense of a radical first step, recognizing that there is power differential on both sides, that artists have every right and should say, this is what I need, this is what I want. And I appreciate that around the sense of artists that are sometimes like, you want to know how I feel? Kevin and I were doing some workshops with the National Ballet a while ago, and that was the response of some of the dancers. What do you mean, how do I feel? What do you mean I can talk about these kinds of things? And that's really critically important. That's really critically, otherwise we're mapping an idea onto a person and saying, this is how it's got to be done. There's no variation. I don't care what you may have to offer. I'm not even going to ask you if you have anything to offer. This is just what I want to see. And what does that do in terms of cutting off the potential for growth? As artists, we're all involved in that unknown space called creativity, where ideally, if you go in it, you don't know what the end product is going to be. That's what you're working toward. So how do we take that same kind of, if I can call it that, anxiety into this kind of relationship building? And I want to touch upon one other thing that was just said as well, in terms of whether it's blood or whatever it is. One of the articles that Kevin and I continue to talk about is a really important piece by Cornel West called The New Cultural Politics of Difference. And in it, Cornel makes a lot of bold statements, and he makes one of his usual ones where he says, there will be no change in civilization without crisis. because things are moving along in a certain way, and then suddenly says, this is not working for me. And if you want me to work with you, then we've got, whoa, there's a crisis, because the status quo needs to recognize difference. It has to recognize the depth of that difference. It has to recognize what it has contributed to that difference. And it has to take steps to say, okay, right, got it. How can we start? Where do we start? What can we begin? I have a comment here, and I'll read it out. Clarifying and negotiating expectations as early as possible in the process seems like an enormously valuable investment of time. Getting past the assumption, as one panelist said. Yes, very true, very true. And that's what I talked about at the outset. Time can be the enemy, but time can also be the friend. You say, okay, we need to spend this time. We have to start now, not 2 weeks later, not contract signed, let's have a conversation. From I want you in this space, or I want to be in your space, how do we then talk? Make sure, is this the right space? Is this the right time? What does it mean then to become familiar with the language that different artists may use, or different presenters may use? It was interesting in the conversation we're having with Can Stage Illuminato, because at one point, do we use the term presenter? Do we use the term producer? What's the significant difference between the two? Right? And so those are things that we need to get a better understanding of as we go along. Just looking to see if there's any other chats or if any of the panelists, including yourself, Anita, want to add more to the conversation. And those of you here, please feel free to, you know, if you have something to say, we have microphones. Come, borrow a microphone.
I have a question.
So everybody can hear you.
Hi everyone, online and in person. My name's Lanny Milstein. I'm a producer, currently with Luminato, but I've worked in several organizations across the fine city of Toronto. And as we are all working through this, my question, the question that is rising to the top more and more is, especially looking at the recommendations in your report, which thank you so much for it. The question arises as we talk about onboarding of how do we do this without putting more burden on the artist? It's always, and talking about assumptions, like I've realized throughout this short conversation already that I make an assumption that the artist wants to be left alone to do their thing. And that's kind of an approach that I sort of default to, like I'm here to support, and the artist, you know, just wants to show up and do their thing, and they don't want a more lengthy onboarding process. How do we find that happy medium where everybody's getting what they want and they need? And I know it's, you know, many artists have many different needs, and some will welcome more onboarding and more conversation and more in-person meetings, but others won't. And so how do we balance that with establishing best practices in an organization and something consistent at the same time being able to accommodate diverse artists, diverse needs? Thank you. And thank you to Ryan and AC so much for being here. It's so great to be able to join presenters, producers, and artists together to talk about this.
Anybody want to take that on?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say another assumption is also that the artist knows. And that's a big internal conversation that we're having. Is like, well, what like, is that a realistic expectation or assumption that an artist knows exactly? Well, this is all that I need. Here's my laundry list of needs. You know. So, yeah. So I think there's, for me, there's maybe a few things. One is again time, so that there can be generative conversation where things can percolate and people can think and go back, and that time is financed so that it's not sort of free labor, but that it's part of the work. You know, that's a piece of it. I think another piece of it is through practice, hopefully there's a body of knowledge that starts to accumulate inside an institution. So an institution can show up with some ideas, some thoughts, some, here are some practices, here are some really successful ways of organizing your first day, but that's through time and repetition. That's as far as I've gotten with those thoughts.
Thank you for that, Brendan. Yeah, and about these assumptions too that you mentioned as well. Some interesting assumptions that I've come up with. It's if you want to speak from an Indigenous relationship perspective. I co-founded an Aboriginal arts organization in Edmonton in 2009 with Christine Sakimo-Frederick called Alberta Aboriginal Performing Arts. And we're from the community. We have family and reserves all around Edmonton. We're like, hey, this is great. We're going to start working with communities. We're going to be bringing work out there. Well, 4 years later, we still hadn't been able to do that because it takes that long to build relationship. And the assumption was we knew what they wanted. We thought we were bringing Indigenous art that had been there, and that was an assumption we made, rather than really building relationship and finding out what they need. When you bring a play into a reserve, you're not doing them a gift, they're actually giving you a gift, and you have to understand how to do that. Another assumption too is which I produced and toured the play Huff that Charles mentioned that premiered here in 2005 on the stage, and one of the assumptions are, and it's great because it took a while for presenters to start asking these questions, and I didn't even think to do it, but they're like, so should we be smudging the space? Are we? One festival was, well, we give every show that comes in, we bring in, we give a nice bottle of champagne in the care package. Is that okay? Because you're an Indigenous artist, and I said, thank you so much for asking that, and yes, please. But it's an amazing question. Even a land acknowledgement, we prefer not to have. We do not have a land acknowledgement before our show. That when we toured for very specific reasons for the artist and the work itself. Having an elder before, like these are things that now that we're on this other side of I guess land acknowledgement world, that's just assumed now even on that side, the assumptions. I just wanted to share that assumptions that's going to happen. That because you have something to offer doesn't mean that's what that other people want. Other people want, and one example which was really incredible when Daryl Cloran took over the Citadel Theatre in Edmonton. He said, we had a meeting in this first month, and he said, it's really important that we have a connection with the Aboriginal community in Edmonton, which is very large. And he said, so we're just gonna put it in a budget line. We're gonna hire an Indigenous liaison, period. Every year, have one on staff, because they will guide us and help us build that relationship. And it's a budget line. It's, it's financially there, and making this space, not asking someone else, because it was eventually an artist, who is taking time out of their practice, who is taking, which brings to mind another element that we were talking about the other week. I realized when I was doing a play, when I was asked as an actor to basically copy, edit the program that the marketing people put together about murdered and missing Indigenous women, and I went, we're opening in a few days. I'm sorry, not my job description. Why don't we reach out to? I could reach out to maybe one or two of these people in our community. Maybe we can hire them. They can look at it. There'd be much more. And I realized just using the term consultant really helps those kinds of conversations, because if you're hiring a stunt choreographer, if you're hiring a historian for a period piece, they are consultants. Something that's very specific, and that to me is a way that shifts the system, as you said. How do we change the system? Big systems take a long time to change, and we've just started. It is, and I'm just started reading a book called Changing Systems by a woman who helped do 40 years ago the whole climate change thing, and she talks about that. Yes, it takes a long time, and relationships take a long time. Another duh moment, Naomi. It's like, duh, yeah, relationships takes a long time. Building trust takes a long time. And I think what really helps is finding allies, but not those kind, the other kind, allies for major organizations and institutions. What blew my mind, I remember when Tim Carroll came into the Shaw Festival 5 years ago, he just cold called me at the office here at Native Earth and said, hey, I think it's crazy that Shaw doesn't have a relationship with the local Indigenous community. Can I take you out for dinner and can I ask you a bunch of questions? We did, and he kept that conversation going. And I said, top down, it's got to be board of directors. Then you got to have directors, Indigenous board of directors, Indigenous directors not directing Indigenous plays, Indigenous actors, and then you actually have resources within your organization to help guide you. If you have someone at board level, because these conversations can't happen with like the ushers who are volunteering. Like it's top level conversations that a lot of these things start. And if you have a voice at the table on your board of directors, well, that helps. Finding those resources. I know I was aware that was my role as the artistic director at Native Earth, which I know other artistic directors doesn't have to take. I would tell other ADs in the city would call me, ask about, do you have any casting suggestions? But I'm like, yes. Or even other questions, say, call me. I consider my role as a resource for this community. I know I have access to our community and aware of our people in our community. Please let me help you. Please do this, and please ask questions. Although that can be scary and odd. Jonathan Holloway, who I think he just left the Melbourne Arts Festival, was telling me how he came from England. And all of a sudden, the local Aboriginal elder is saying, hey, you and I, we will be the beginning of the parade. And he's like, well, but no, it's you. He's like, no, you represent your people, we represent our people, and we're walking together. And he's like, well, I don't know anything. Do you mind if I ask questions? And the elder said, yes, you have to ask questions. However, be aware, there are people with trauma who have been in those situations before. And I know other experiences is some people may not want to answer your questions because of the experiences they've also had. And I have talked to colleagues who that has shut them down and made them feel unable to ask other people's questions. So that's just a reminder that we are still in very sensitive times. As Indigenous artists, we are often asked to do work that is either personally connected to our own experience, our family's connected experience, or our communities. Even though they're just a play, many of us have direct contact with that trauma in these plays. And so just being gentle and which brings in a whole other element, I think, just a layer. I lost my train of thought on that, but I'll end there and offer it up.
Thank you so much for that, Ryan. I appreciate your words so much, and it sparked a lot of thoughts for me. One thing which, when we think of the term Indigenous, obviously we're thinking about the people on this land, but obviously indigeneity means that those that are, born and bred on the land. So as me, as a Ghanaian Togolese woman, I still have indigeneity to the countries of which my parents chose to leave to come and settle here in Canada. So I think it's also understanding and broadening, like when we are thinking about the practices of who we are, that is a practice that is in the process of being remembered. When my parents came here, it was more about assimilating to what it meant to be quote unquote Canadian. And through that assimilation, the choices of for me, I was very lucky. I still had a link to my heritage. I still had a link to the dances, to what happened when somebody transitioned, what happened when somebody had a baby, like the celebrations that happened within community. It was something that I grew up very closely with. And that to me is something that not everybody gets. I was very fortunate, and I think about that as I'm eventually will transition to be a mother. My child won't have that relationship to the community that I had. And so to me, it's like I feel as a duty as an artist to figure out how to preserve those things. How can I preserve my heritage, my culture, the things that are the seeds, the things that my ancestors are gifting me to be able to bring forward, so that way my children have something to hold on to. I think oftentimes as as Ryan had just mentioned, you know, some of these experiences are a reflection of life in many ways. And as we think about that reflection in life, that I'm not just creating art that just is there and it's stagnant and it goes up and then it ends. To me, it's a growth process. It's who are we when we started? Who are we when we do the work? Who are we when we end, when we close it for that moment? And then that birthing process continues. It's a cycle. You know, kudos to the artists that you know, create work and have it seen in this specific way. But for me, I'm really looking at the growth process. How can I grow as an artist? Who am I? When I created Shades 2016 and when it was up in 2018, 2019, by the time Shades comes back, it's going to be a completely different show in my eyes because of the growth and who I am and who we are as people and how we've evolved and what that seeds into the work. And to me, I think it's just necessary to understand, again, all of the indigenous practices that we walk in with. I know Irma is as an artist is always somebody that is speaking to that because there's an aspect of remembering and having space to just to be vulnerable, to recognize that I'm moving through a state of unknowingness. And I'm trying to listen to what my ancestors are trying to speak to me. And I'm trying to understand all of what you're asking me. But there's a large sense of vulnerability of what, as an artist, of what you need to move through just to feel okay to then present the art. In terms of what is being asked, you know, when I had done a film last year that a few organizations across the country were able to support me with, Tessel, that particular production was really interesting, or that particular film rather was really interesting, because, you know, I had to step in. I had to step in to ensure that my work was created in the way that I wanted to be seen, because there's nothing worse to create the work and then get to the dissemination of the work and the language that describes the work isn't what you want it to be. And that requires more for me as an artist to have to step in, to have to make sure to do the vetting process to say, no, I'm not okay with this. So who else needs to be at the table? Who needs to be there to ensure that I can actually just be the artist and that I don't have to worry about stepping in? I just finished a project where I was directing in Hamilton in my hometown, directing at Theater Aquarius. And that was the first time in my career that I actually just had to just be the artist, and for a certain period of time. And then obviously for me, I'm used to doing more. I'm used to giving more. That's just the nature of my spirit. And I ended up stepping up just to be able to help to bring my community to see this work. Because again, when we curate these spaces and when you curate artists into your spaces, if that community is not seeing the work, then to me, there's a huge disservice. Then how do you get people that look like me? How do you get people that have never seen themselves into that particular institution? How do you get them inspired to want to come out, to want to spend the money, to want to say, you know what, I'm really happy that I came. I'm really happy that I saw myself represented. I never thought that I could see myself represented in this way on that stage. There's a shift, you know. I also understand that financially, you got to do the nutcrackers. You got to do the shows that are going to be able to pay your box office and to pay the artists in order for you to also be able to do, to invest in the community in a more meaningful way. Like both of those things go hand in hand, you know, with having a closer relationship with MBS and some of the folks at the company MBOC. I didn't realize how much money Nutcracker brings in. And every ballet company that I work with, it's like, oh yeah, I've got to do the Nutcrackers because that's basically what ends up funding the whole entire season. So I understand from a financial standpoint what you need to do to be able to make sure that your organization stays afloat. So then how do you create the balance if you are going to shift outside of the box? How do you create the balance that allows you to say, okay, we're going to have these things that are going to make us money. And then we're also going to have these things to ensure that we can create a more meaningful way forward for people. And then just the last thing that I want to be able to say is and understanding that we are connected to different communities and we want to bring elders into those spaces. I think that we need to understand a vetting process for elders. I know that it seems sometimes rude to say, but I think that we have to understand who we are saying is the representation of the communities. You know, for me, if you're bringing somebody in, I want to make sure that that person can really be a connecting factor to the work and to me as an artist, if you're going to be the elder in the space. And so, really, to me, it's opening up the conversation to know that we are bringing the right type of people that I feel are going to help to push the way forward. Because to be honest, all indigenous groups from around the world, the assimilation to whiteness is real. And sometimes that trickle downs in a way that we may not be receptive to, or we may not want to say or even call out. So I think it's necessary for us to really be honest in who it is that we bring into the spaces and recognize that, okay, maybe this particular person or these particular people that we brought in maybe did not serve the community as best as we had thought. And how can we shift who it is that we bring into those spaces to ensure that the right type of people are being able to bring the messaging forward, and that it's not just about serving whiteness, and that we're going beyond and deeper into that. You know, we've all been disconnected from our roots in some way, shape, or form. So that reconnection looks differently for different people.
Thank you. We have about 15 minutes left, and this seems like a conversation that's just getting started. So I do want to invite others to join in on any of the things. But I want to see if we can look at, and Brenda, I'm going to go back to your term on social architecture. So I think you were talking about it just a second ago as well, in a sense of how do we build communities that are appreciating the difference of what we're doing? You know, because we hear this all the time, well, the Nutcracker, yes, it is what it is, and that's no doubt about it. But at the same time, I'm getting a little tired of hearing, well, you know, if we take that, it's a risk. We probably won't get as many people. We probably have to then, you know, subsidize it through. So it's this deficit model that continues, as opposed to, in my view, saying, hey, if we're living in this society in which we have artists from indigenous background, artists from various racialized backgrounds, artists who've come here as immigrants, artists who may be, you know, triggered or carrying trauma that comes through, how do we prepare whatever you consider your audiences to be to find this work as valuable and impactful? And at the same time, how do you then reach to communities that these artists are coming from so they're part of the scene as well? So I think it's just one of those areas of moving away from the deficit model of, well, we need to do this because it will subsidize that, to how do we build this? So maybe it's subsidizing the Nutcracker one day.
I mean, that makes me think about how do you change the Nutcracker as a way to change the audience, as a way to change. I mean, using that as an example, when people, you know, the Nutcracker can be cast and choreographed and designed in different ways and still deliver the familiar tunes and, you know, the expectations that certain audiences have. And yet you can, I mean, there are ways to take a different approach to it, and I know that's been done. I mean, I think also, for example, you know, another Christmas classic, the pantomime, that theater replacement in Vancouver has been remaking pantomimes now for, I think it's 8 or 9 years, taking so-called traditional fairy tales and the traditional material of the panto, not a form I'm personally familiar with, just saying, but taking, and there's an audience that has an expectation of what that might be, but then they inject that form with politics and casting and storytelling that is not the traditional expectation, and yet uses some of the form that is pleasing, you know. So I think there are ways also of, I mean, you know, tricking your old audience into becoming part of your new audience while also constantly trying to attract your new audience, which should be an audience that better reflects the cities that we live in and not just a small, section of them. Certainly, there are lots of barriers, financial barriers for people to come to take a risk on something, right? Like, I'm not going to go to something that I'm not feeling comfortable, that I don't think that I might not enjoy if it's going to cost me a lot of money. I've always found that to be one of the peculiarities of being a professional in the theater community, is that I don't pay for very many of my tickets. Like, I try to, if I don't go to opening night, I buy my tickets. But if I go to opening night, I'm not paying, so my risk is lower, right? I can go to things that I think, well, maybe I'll like that, maybe I'll feel comfortable, maybe I won't. And so we have to get, like, we can't use ourselves as examples when we're thinking about the real audience out there, the people who are feeling like the risk is real, right? And how you spend your $20, your $40, your $60, depending on your ability, is an important one. I know that's a little bit of a different, sorry, I'm getting tangential here. I think just to go back to I keep thinking about specificity, right? I mean, we talk about in all of these conversations that we have to have, they have to be conversations. They can't just be emails and documentation. They do take time if we're going to do things differently, just like a good relationship takes time and you can't just take it for granted. But also to be specific and to be willing to look at the details and change the details if necessary to fit the scenario, and to find the place where all the parties can find the most common ground. And I think that's the sort of at the essence of this, of some of the recommendations here. But mostly we just have to set aside more time, which is, a contradiction in so much of the way we currently are organized.
The issue of time, I'm reminded of, here we are, a little bit of theory, the Frankfurt School, cultural industries. We produce because it fits within a certain ecology. The ecology happens to be a bit infused by capitalism, so as you say, ticket costs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And when people are available, right? Weekends, evenings, that kind of stuff. And then the question is, how do we subvert that to begin looking at time as planning for the benefit of those who are within the community? So a couple of things have come up about, do you pay the artist for the time you're negotiating a contract? Yes. Yes. Otherwise, they'll do what Khalil El-Jabbar did. I'll sign it, give me the money. Oh, by the way, Farah, you're supposed to give a keynote. So that's a really important thing. When Ryan uses the term consultant, we do a lot of focus groups with Sakamo. And when we do, we always say to the organizer, the persons who've asked us to, are you able to offer an honorarium? How many people will come? 10, 15, 20, 30? I don't know, we'll see. But once you make it clear that you're gonna offer this honorarium and pay for their time, then we'll get some real numbers. And people will feel they're being valued as opposed to being exploited. So these are some of the things that we need to really think about in terms of how are we engaging. And I have to go back, as I say earlier, to that report that's in your chat room, Tilling the Field, because it talks about and it provides a number of templates for these kinds of negotiations to take place. Based upon a lot of research, because that's the way we do our work, to kind of say, okay, if you're dealing with two groups that are different, they will be different, then how do you navigate across that difference? We still have a few more minutes left, and I just want to see if anyone else wants to make comment, either from this audience or from the online audience. And there's going to be a breakout session right after this panel, so people, you might want to talk more in depth on your own about some of the issues that come up today. So I'll open it if anyone else. Anita, you've been quiet the whole time.
Hello? Yes. Am I here? Okay. No, it's really great to hear the reflections on the document. And I think and also I just wanted to address Lanny's question again, because that came up as a big question with all the research too, was that I think you said something about how do you know what the artist needs? Or could you just give me a quick, what was that last question that you left us with?
Well, I think my big question was just in terms of establishing a best practice or best practices, you know, how do you balance finding a protocol for your organization with diverse artist needs? What is a welcome process for one artist is a burden for another.
Right. Yeah. And yeah, great. That's what I wanted my memory jog at. Yeah, and a lot of the conversations I've had with various artistic directors and folks is that there is no one way, and that part of it is that question is, what do you need? And I think that came up repeatedly for the organization, and not the what do you need in terms of what do you need and then walk all over us, right? Because it's got to be a two-way street, right? Because organizations have their limitations financially, time-wise. But starting that conversation with what do you need in order to feel supported and feel that you can be successful in this process, and then from there is to set up what needs to happen, and then the offer then can come in also. I'm just thinking of one organization that said that we will have that conversation first, and then we will say these are our expectations, and how does this meet up with your expectations, and what do you need? This is what we would like to check in with you on a weekly basis. We would like our producer to come in. How can we make space for that? What do you need? So I think it all comes down to that big question at the very beginning, at the very initial. I think Charles has also talked about that first meeting and or the first few meetings to really establish that. So yeah, it would be great if everybody could wave a magic wand and say this works for everybody, but it doesn't, because groups have different needs, individuals have different needs, and the nature of each project has different needs. So, but I think really going back to that basic question will then help you create a template together. I think there's basic templates there, but I think the message that I'm hearing from this group and also from all the research is that you need to create this together, and that will give you the greatest success with each individual artist group. And yes, that does take more time and perhaps finances.
Circling back, I'm fine with the Nutcracker subsidizing any of our work. I just want to say that. I am like totally fine with that. Because circling back, it is going to take a long time to change this. It is going to take a very, very long time. And in that meantime, we need the Nutcrackers to sell the seats. I have friends that take their kids to the Nutcracker every Christmas. They don't see any other theater. I've known them for 20 years, and I'm fine with that. And it's great. It gives them joy and value and entertainment. But right now, like with Huff, it's such a challenging piece, an incredible piece that often our presenters, the negotiation, about 5 years ago was, well, because it's in a smaller venue, we doubt we'll be able to sell that much tickets to cover the presenting fee. It's like, yeah, well, the presenting fee is a presenting fee. And I've seen it shift over the last 5 years to, this show is so important, it doesn't matter if we actually break even on this show. Like when the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. doubles their presenting fee because they say they want to have the US premiere right before the pandemic, and knowing they're going to lose money, knowing that that's the shift that needs to happen in that kind of building. And it's going to take, it's going to start with 5 people, it's going to start with 10. We don't have to have the all indigenous Nutcracker, perhaps, but why not? But like it doesn't have to, like we don't. What I'm saying is we're creating our new system. We're creating our new protocols and templates. We're making space for the new work being created by artists who haven't had access to these spaces anymore or had these stories in these spaces anymore. And it's going to be a big shift. People in this country still do not believe in residential schools. It's going to take a long time, and that's okay. Because we're having this conversation, we're having this space, we're all here at this table, you're here joining us now. It's exciting. It's really exciting for me. Thanks.
Thank you, and thanks to all the panelists. It's interesting when we talk about this change, either on the institution side or on the community side, if we can use those binaries for a moment. We started off this week in an invitation-only session with CEOs of very large institutions in the cultural industry, both in music and performing arts. And the keynote was given by the passed recently, she just moved on, Chief Commissioner of the Canadian Human Rights Commission. And there were three key messages that I think she gave to these CEOs. Yes, you are alone. You need to talk to each other. Right? You need to talk with each other to understand, because the CEO or the artistic director, they're in the middle of the sandwich, if you can call that, the board and the people who report to them. So whom do they talk to about sensitive, difficult issues? And so the question was, you need to talk to each other. So that, we're seeing so many organizations that have diversity, equity, inclusion committees, using terms like decoloniality, decolonization, anti-racism, anti-oppression. And oftentimes I say, well, what do you mean by them? And why do you think they all mean the same thing? So conversations are really helpful at that level. But what she also pointed out is there is an incredibly important business case. For example, said by 2040, 40% of Canada will be racialized. 40%. And we're doing some work in Saskatchewan, and I was surprised when one of the resources in Saskatchewan told me that by 2030, Indigenous people will be about 1/3 of the population in Saskatchewan. So we're talking about massive change happening in our communities. And when I look at working with artists, I know I've spent a lot of my time developing, fighting for, arguing about, whatever, anti-racism, equity, you name it. Whereas a number of younger artists, this is the life they're growing up in. And so they approach things very differently. The expectation is, you invite me in, you should know where I'm coming from. Right? Because we use these terms and then they work in the arts in this way. So those are, yes, parts of the conversation. And yes, it's going to take time. But I think at the same time, the other aspect that she raised was around how we build constituencies, how do we build allies, how do we build friends, how do we build this public presence around the importance of the change that we are experiencing, whether we want to recognize it or not. We are experiencing these changes. Now, the end of September, we have the National Truth and Reconciliation, right? We also have other days of significance throughout the year that we're beginning to talk about more often in workplaces and in communities. So basically, the change is happening. The question is, what are we contributing to it? And as presenters or producers and as artists, how are we having those conversations in gentle and clear ways to make sure that that happens? We're a minute over time. And I want to end on that note because this will be an ongoing conversation and we hope that you will all become engaged and involved, whether you're on the screen or in the room. So again, thanks to our panelists, thanks to those who have joined us on Zoom.